Thank you very much, Peter. Esteemed colleagues, guests, friends, it is my great pleasure and honor to represent the World History Association at this important symposium. You have in front of you a quotation from the Tao Te Ching, which I shall not read to you. You can read it yourself. It's well known. It is both very simple and exceedingly complex. Scholars have spent lifetimes trying to understand and plumb the mysteries of that particular sentence. But certainly it does mean one thing that we can all agree on. Humanity and nature must be in harmony with one another. If they fail to harmonize, disaster follows. Today, I want to tell you a story about a particular place where I live. It is Vermont. And you ask yourself, where is Vermont? Vermont is right over there. It is the 8th smallest state in the United States. It is a state of little more than 600,000 persons. It is exceedingly small, and yet we like to think very important. The name Vermont comes from the French. It means Green Mountain. Now, the Green Mountain state of Vermont is defined geographically by 2 river valleys. Here in the west, we have the Champlain River Valley, and in the east, the river valley of the Connecticut River. There are also 2 major mountain chains that run up and down the spine of Vermont. The Green Mountains to the west and the Appalachian Mountains to the east. The fact is, Vermont is very mountainous, and today it is heavily forested. 78.2% of the state is forested. That is essentially 1.62 million hectares of woodland. It is the 4th most forested state in the United States. Here we see the state capital of Montpelier. It is a city of fewer than 8,000 persons today. It is nestled amid the verdant hills of the Green Mountains. And here we can see green giving way to autumnal colors. Today, Montpelier is almost lost in the forests that surround it, but that was not always the case. Here we have a bird's eye view of Montpelier in 1884. I want to bring to your attention the simple fact that it is virtually devoid of woods. During the last half of the 19th century, 85% of the state of Vermont was deforested. Now, of course, as I said, trees fill the landscape. The question is, how did this all come about? Although the devastation of forest land that had taken place in the 19th century was slowly being reversed in the early 19th century, recovery was exceedingly slow, as this postcard from 1912 shows. But let us go back a bit in history. Let us go back to the early 17th century. In the year 1609, the French explorer Samuel de Champlain sailed into the lake that today bears his name. And what he saw was a land where the lake and river valleys of this place that later became Vermont were under cultivation. They were under cultivation by the indigenous people known as the Abnaki. Now, the Abnaki used controlled burning to clear large areas of land. On that land, as you can see from this engraving of 1724 in the upper register, they grew maize, beans, corn, and squash and tobacco. But there were vast tracts of virgin conifers and virgin hardwoods that covered most of the region. The fact is that the Abenaki were not very populous. There were maybe 10,000 of them in Vermont in 1609. And indeed, in addition to growing their agricultural produce in the river valleys and lake valley, they also used the forest for its sugar maple. It was the Abenaki who learned the secret of boiling down the sap of the maple tree to create a sugar, which they ate. Despite their slash and burn farming techniques, the Abenaki, whose population, as I said, was exceedingly small, had little impact on the forest lands beyond the valleys. Indeed, they depended upon these valleys, these forests, for a wide variety of wild game birds and such building materials as white cedar wood, winter birch bark, and spruce roots. From the white cedar wood, the winter birch bark, and the spruce roots, they constructed houses, such as the wigwam and the log house, and they also constructed their famous canoes. Likewise, when early Euro settlers came to Vermont, their numbers were few. The earliest French and Anglo colonists had very little impact upon the forest environment. But that all changed. That all changed in the course of the first half of the 19th century, as the population of this frontier state grew dramatically. A growing population, indeed a population that was growing in the late 18th and early 19th century almost exponentially, led to intensive farming and also to large-scale animal husbandry. Farmers were hungry for land, and in their hunger, they moved into the higher regions of the state's hills and mountains, despite the fragility of the rocky soils in those mountains. One of the major new activities which these farmers embarked upon was the raising of merino sheep. The merino sheep is known as the hill sheep. It is called the hill sheep, and it comes from Iberia, from Portugal and Spain, because of its ability to exist on the vegetation on the high hillsides. Responding to a national demand for wool, farmers in the 1820s began importing merino sheep from Spain and Portugal and clearing hillsides on which to pasture these animals that are noted for their hardiness as well as their fine wool. Due to this merino mania, as it was called, by 1837, there were over 1 million merino sheep in the state. That is, there were probably about 10 sheep for every man, woman, and child who lived in the state. Now, this led, of course, as you can well imagine, let us remember again the principles of the Tao, this led to overproduction. That overproduction, as well as changes in national tariff laws, led to a dramatic drop in wool prices in the late 1840s, which caused the ruination of the merino sheep industry and also destroyed the fortunes of many farmers and wool fabric processors. Despite the bottoming out of the merino wool market, as late as around 1900, flocks of merino sheep could still be seen on denuded hillsides throughout this state, as we see in this photo of around 1900. Driven by what we might call a Calvinist Protestant ethic. A Calvinist Protestant ethic that viewed the earth as a place to be dominated and to be used by the human agents of God. A rapidly expanding Vermont population also engaged in indiscriminate cutting of forest lands. The cutting of forest lands for the purpose of logging. Here we see winter logging around the year 1890. Note again the denuded hills in the background. As the previous slide suggested, clear-cut logging was the preferred method. Why? Well, as we all know, it is the most efficient and profitable means of extracting timber, at least in the short run. As this slide of an old postcard shows, in the spring, massive log drives took place along the Connecticut River in eastern Vermont, with the timber headed for the small industrial city of Bellows Falls. Bellows Falls, which is located in southeastern Vermont. In 1802, entrepreneurs constructed the first paper mill in Bellows Falls. And when two railroads converged there in 1849, the city became a major mill town. By 1859, Bellows Falls had a woolen mill as well as factories producing furniture, cabinetry, and a wide variety of other wooden goods. Its principal products, however, were wood pulp paper and farm machinery for the industrial and small farms of the region. Needless to say, this industrial activity, especially pulp paper production, filled the air of Bellows Falls with toxic pollution, as well as polluting the river that we call Connecticut. In the western part of the state, lumber was floated down Lake Champlain and also carried overland to the largest city in the state, Burlington. Here in Burlington was a large-scale lumber processing industry. There were numerous lumber processing mills in and around Burlington, which were turning raw lumber into finished board. In 1856, Burlington produced 47,194 cubic meters of cut and processed lumber. In 1889, that figure had risen to 884,901 cubic meters of processed lumber in one small city on Lake Champlain. Most of this finished lumber was exported through the lake port of Burlington. In the 19th century, little Burlington, Vermont, again, let us put this in perspective. Today, Burlington, Vermont has a population of 45,000. In the 19th century, it had a population, including the university, of around 20,000 at the very, very most. But despite its small size, Burlington in the 19th century was the third most active lumber exporting port in the entire United States of America. This, however, as we say in American English, was a zero-sum game. The prodigious rate of logging rapidly used up the diminishing forests. By 1921, Vermont had ceased to be a North American leader in the processing and exportation of lumber. The lumber had run out. Vermont farmers in the 19th century also attempted large-scale production of grains and hay. Grains and hay to feed both the demand for cereals beyond Vermont's borders and also to feed the rapidly growing dairy industry at home. After the merino wool industry died, dairy became the predominant agricultural industry in Vermont. Here we see Richmond, Vermont, along the shores of the Winooski River in the late 19th century. I should show you that, shouldn't I? Note the barren hills. The same field, but from another angle, was shot a few days ago. Note the river bottom is still the same. The river bottom is still used to grow feed for animals, but note the verdant fields surrounding, the verdant hills surrounding those fields. So, here we have a story of Vermont in the 19th century rapidly depleting its forest lands. By 1850, 85% of the state is denuded. But change is coming. There were several voices raised in protest, not at the use, but at the abuse of the state's and nation's forests. Undoubtedly, the most influential voice was that of a native Vermonter, George Perkins Marsh. Marsh was appalled at the deforestation of lands around his home in Woodstock. His book of 1864, Man and Nature, has been characterized as the second most popular and influential scientific treatise of the 19th century, second only to Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. In Man and Nature, Marsh argued that due to massive, indiscriminate deforestation, in his words, the earth is fast becoming an unfit home for its noblest inhabitant. His prophetic cry of doom and destruction did not go unheeded. The book was widely read in the United States and beyond, and it has been credited with changing the attitudes of many powerful individuals in the United States and abroad. Among the many public actions credited to this new awareness of the central place of forest lands in maintaining a harmonious balance between humanity and nature was passage by the United States Congress of the Forest Reserves Act in 1891, an act that empowered the president to set aside tracts of forest that stood at the headwaters of rivers that supply water to major U.S. citizens. The justification for this bill that created the basis for the USA's national forest system was straight out of Man and Nature. As important as Perkins and many other early, I call him Perkins, as important as Marsh and many other early prophets of environmental conservation were in raising consciousness and changing attitudes, practices, and regulations, it was the coming together of demographic and economic forces that ultimately played the major role in reforesting Vermont. Several interconnected phenomena were at work from the latter half of the 19th century to the Great Depression of the 1930s. The great grain fields of the Midwest proved far too formidable a competitor to the hard-scrambled grain fields of Vermont. As already noted, logging also became economically less viable as the industry used up rapidly diminishing forests at a prodigious rate. One consequence of the economic downturn was virtual demographic stagnation. Between 1850 and 1940, the state's total recorded population grew by only 14.5%. Over a period of 90 years, the population of the United States of America grew by roughly 550%. Vermont's grew by 14.5%. Massive flight out of the state. Flight particularly by the youngest people. This was a constant reality during these decades, and abandoned farms and logging areas were left to encroaching new growth forests of white pine and shade-tolerant trees. Here we see the sad remains of the Gideon Ricker farm, high on Ricker Mountain. 4 generations had lived here between 1839 and the early 20th century. The barn, which once measured 36.5 meters in length, is today a hole in the ground, as you can see. Nearby are the sad reminders of the Ricker family tombstones. George Perkins Marsh had warned that severe and frequent floods were a natural consequence of deforestation. And Vermont surely had experienced a number of severe floods during the 19th century. There was, for example, the torrent of 1830. But ironically, the worst was yet to come. The worst was to come just as Vermonters were beginning to understand the consequences of deforestation, just as they were attempting to do something to undo the harm. In 1927, in the spring, 17 Vermont towns combined their energies and resources to plant 267,000 trees along the bare hillsides that surrounded those towns. This was, as we say in English, a classic example of too little, too late. In that same year of 1927, the state suffered its worst recorded flood. November rains soaked recovering hillsides beyond their capacity to hold water, and massive devastation followed throughout the state. More than 1,200 bridges were swept away. Countless private and public buildings were destroyed. The recovery of forest lands was just too slow in coming for the victims of 1927. Ironically, here we see the newest building of the Roy Brothers woodenware factory being swept away. Reportedly, the Roy Brothers lost 3,540 cubic meters of processed lumber on that one day. Recovery, however, did come. Today, state laws closely regulate logging, especially logging in uplands, wetlands, and along watersheds. Thanks to the recovery of Vermont's woodlands, large wildlife, such as deer, moose, and black bears, which had virtually disappeared in the course of the 19th century, are at an all-time recorded high in their respective populations. But this second and third growth forest land is quite different from the forests once known to the Abenaki and the earliest European settlers. Its diversity is nowhere near as great, and this alone is reason for regret and concern. But happily, the sugar maple continues to give up its sweet sap in the spring, making Vermont the nation's leader in maple syrup production. And today, its hard and softwoods also provide the state's numerous artisans, artists, and one-of-a-kind furniture makers with a renewable and beautiful medium for their artistry. Burlington, Vermont, once noted for its wood mills and docks laden with raw and finished lumber, is today a charming university city, a city, as I noted, of 45,000 souls and 20,000 students. It boasts shops selling high-end, handcrafted furniture and numerous wooden implements of every sort. I thank you for your kind attention. Shishi.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. We have time for one or two questions. Perhaps I may ask one question, because you paint a dramatic picture which, as environmentalists today, we could easily, if we would live in the 19th century, we would say Vermont is totally lost and now it's green again, albeit with less biodiversity. Can you explain why this huge, massive deforestation in the mountains did not lead to irreversible loss of fertility on these mountains, as for instance in the Massif Central in France?
Well, to begin with, the mountains, despite the fact that they attracted farmers, are not that fertile to begin with. Vermont, as you know, is carved out by the glaciers of 4 major ice ages, particularly the last ice age. And what we have in Vermont, as we say, we grow rocks. particularly rocks in the northern regions of our mountains. So these farmers who struggled in the highlands were persons who were marginally prosperous to begin with. And that's why also merino sheep attracted them in the beginning. We also have in Vermont...
A short answer in view of the time.
Okay, all right. I wanted to talk about something else that's happening, but okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We move on.